I grew up with a guy who I remained friends with well into our adult age, and this guy was from one of those huge families that had like 40 cousins. They told me a story one night that raised the hair on the back of my neck. My friend had a sister who had recently got married, and her husband were both going to veterinarian school at Oklahoma State, and they commuted from another small town in Oklahoma. This town is very historic, with many old beautiful homes and buildings, but a lot of them look just like something you would see in a ghost story. This home they rented was connected with the Catholic church in town, and had once been the home that the nuns would stay in. The church had it renovated, made it into a really nice house, and rented it to the public. My friend told me that once his sister had settled in, they decided to go on their honeymoon, and they asked him to house sit. Since he was a single guy living at home, they thought he could enjoy the time alone. He told me from the very first night, he would wake up with the wind blowing past him. He said at times it was enough to wisp his hair around, and he could even hear it. He told me this was October, and he did not have the heat on. He could never find the inlet for this rushing air. He said he constantly had this being watched feeling, and was very uncomfortable. He was more than happy when his sister returned so he could leave. His cousin, my other friend, also stayed a weekend there, and he said the same thing happened to him, only it had gotten worse, to the point the TV would turn on in the middle of the night, and also the wind flowing around him. He was glad to get out of the house too. The two cousins happened to discuss it one evening, and were amazed that it had happened to each of them. They both talked about it to the sister the next time they saw each other, and expected it to be a big joke, but were shocked at what the sister had to tell them. In this house was a doorway that led from the kitchen up a flight of stairs to a small attic space. She had noticed as they were moving in that the dog would sit and growl at the door. She assumed an animal was the cause, but he was relentless at guarding that door. They had decided to keep some boxes in the attic space, and her husband kept complaining of feeling ill every time he was up there, but was then fine after he left. He was afraid that there was a gas leak or something causing it. The scariest part was as he cleaned the space up and was stacking boxes, he noticed part of the wall was coming undone. He pulled some of the boards apart and noticed it was a false wall. He got his crowbar and pulled the boards back enough where he could shine his light into the room, and noticed a very old bed that had various toys on it, and they were all over the floor too. He said it scared him because it looked like a place someone was kept inside, away from the public. It was after this day that the activity had gotten more active, and it was noticed by anyone who came into the house. Whatever it was not afraid to let its presence be known. The sister told them that later that night they had gone to bed, and they had heard rustling in the attic, like something was moving around. Her husband got up to investigate. He told her that when he went into the kitchen and turned the light on, all of the noise stopped. He looked up the stairway, but was too scared to walk up, and ended up closing the door. He said the second he flipped the switch to turn off the light, something pounded on the other side of the door, like someone slammed their fist, and he ran to bed scared to death. There was one more incident after this, and then it stayed quiet until they moved out. They were cooking outside one night and had a little picnic table they were sitting at. She said she was making her plate, and her husband said,
Look up at that window.
She said she turned around and the drapes were pulled back, like someone was watching them, but let go as soon as she saw it, and that really freaked them out. Flash forward several years, and I was working as a deputy sheriff for the county. The Catholic Church was having a fall festival, and asked that several deputies and officers come for security, and just to join in. I said sure and showed up to the event, and was walking around talking to the kids when I saw that house. I spoke to one of the priests and was like, screw it, I'm just going to ask him about it, and told him the story. The entire time he just smiled and said, well, we have had quite a few people live in that house, and pretty much all of them had a story to tell, but that was all he would say about it. Later that night, on patrol, I told my partner all about it, and he wanted to see the house. We pulled right up to it at about 3 a.m. We were parked on the street talking about it, when several lights turned on all of a sudden. We both jumped and drove away laughing at ourselves. I'm sure it was probably the current tenant, wondering why a patrol car was parked outside running at that hour. But hearing the history of that place was enough to freak me out. Last year, I was invited to go skiing up in Colorado with a close friend of mine, in their friend's cabin up in the mountains. Obviously, I wanted to go, so during that spring break, we drove the almost 8-hour-long drive to Colorado. And as we were finally getting close to the cabin, it was already snowing heavily and rather dark out. The cabin itself is about 1.5 miles away from the closest little village and was rather isolated, something I am not used to at all. As we traveled farther into the mountains and farther away from the city, I grew more on edge. Once we finally reached the cabin, it was well into the night, and the moment I stepped into the door, I did not like the feeling I got from the place. It felt as though the moment we turned on the lights, a bunch of people ran out the door. It felt occupied. Besides that, the place was massive. It had 6 bedrooms and tons of open space. But as we were getting acquainted with the house, all I could think about was the feeling that someone was living there, or that at least there was a presence. Then as we were going upstairs, we found an amazing door just a couple of feet in front of the last stair. It was made of the side of a tree, like someone went out and cut a section off a tree in the woods and put a handle on it. Under the door was a towel near the crack at the bottom, maybe to keep the cold air that was inside that room out of the rest of the house. Despite this, the door and the room it was hiding immediately gave me a very negative energy. At first, my friend and I were too afraid to even open the door, but eventually curiosity set in, and we wandered into the room. The room inside was at least 30 degrees colder than the room before it, and not just a physical cold either. It felt desolate, and the coldness penetrated through me. And not only was it far colder than the rest of the house, it looked completely different as well. All the others were full of huge king beds with mountains of sheets. This one looked more like a 1950s married couple's room. There was 2 small beds parallel to each other, and they only had sheets. But the scariest thing was there was 2 large crawl spaces on either side of the room. These freaked me out as they looked like tiny places for weird creatures to hide. To see inside these spaces, you had to pull out a flashlight, and there was only some weird boxes in the middle of the passage. After we left that room, I was terrified, to be perfectly honest. Something about it shook me to my core, and I think my friend was just as scared, because even though there were 6 bedrooms in the house, we decided to stay together in only one room. After the first day, things started to get better, even if I still felt a presence in the house. We went skiing, fishing, and spent a lot of time playing ping pong. I liked playing ping pong, except that it was near the bark door, and when the ball fell near the door, we would run and grab it really quick, like something was going to jump out of the room and get us. One night, about 5 days in, my friend's parents were going out for the night, so we were just playing ping pong. It was around midnight when I heard the first knock. The noise immediately sent chills down my back when I realized where it came from. It came from inside the bark door, and we both heard it as clear as day. We looked at each other, hoping the other one didn't hear the sound, but we were both disappointed. We decided to be rational and realized that something inside probably just fell, so we opened the door. As soon as my friend opened it, I ran to hit the light switch, which was far further into the room than I would have liked. I scanned across the room and found nothing, yet it felt as though I was playing hide and seek, and someone or something was there, hiding, just waiting to be found. That's when I hear the second knock. It had come from the crawl space. The someone or something wanted us to find it. The crawlspace door had been hit so hard that I could still see it vibrating a little bit. Utterly terrified, I opened the little door as quick as I could and took a peek in with the flashlight on my phone, half expecting to find a morbid creature. But again, nothing. I was creeped out, but yet I found it somewhat comforting, as I knew it must just have some other explanation. But as I was closing the door and somewhat at peace, I heard 2 knocks. Except this time I didn't just hear it, I felt it. I was still touching the door as it happened. We bolted out of that room and refused to go near it again, even though we had left the light on. The rest of the weekend was purely us trying to forget what had happened. Unfortunately, this story has lived on with us. The feeling of that knock on my hand is something I will never be able to get out of my head. I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time, maybe 13 or 14. I lived down in our basement, and I was the only one with a room down there, so hardly anyone ever came down. My room had a bathroom attached to it, and I had these speakers playing a radio station. It had to have been around 7 p.m. So I'm just laying on my bed listening to music and hanging out, when I look into my bathroom and see a pale female figure in my shower. I remember she had black hair that covered her face, with her hands pressed against the glass. I was really confused, because there was no way that anyone could possibly get in my shower without me seeing. This lady was naked, and she appeared to be young. She had no wrinkly skin or any other aging marks. I remember sitting up in my bed confused when she started screaming. She stayed in the same position, but she was shaking her head back and forth. My radio turned to static, the volume turned up, and her scream started coming through the speakers. I tried to turn the speakers off, but it wouldn't work. I got scared, ran upstairs, and hid in my brother's closet. I only thought I stayed there for a while, but after I went back to my room, I found out it had been over 4 hours. It was going on midnight. When I got to my room, the speakers were off, and my shower door was wide open. I'd never experienced anything paranormal in that house, and nothing happened afterwards ever again. I have no explanation for this, and it was one of the scariest moments in my life. And what's even weirder is even though my speakers were turning up, no one in my family heard a thing. No screaming, no static, nothing. In all of my almost 29 years of life, I've experienced many things that can't always be explained, from the odd to the otherworldly to the paranormal, etc. This story comes from a time when I was only just diving headfirst into my pagan, Wiccan spiritual path. Before then, I dabbled here and there through the years. Back then, I was pretty cocky and overly confident in my fledgling abilities. I was kind of reckless, actually. Like I said, I've seen a lot of things, but this is one that really stuck with me. It was around 2007, just before I turned 18. I was in my obligatory emo phase, and my apathy caused a rift between myself and common sense far too often. My sister, her friend Spike, and myself were just sitting around at my mom's house one night, talking and laughing, playing some video games, normal teenage stuff. Somehow we got on the subject of spirits and seance circles. I don't remember who, but one of us had the genius idea to walk to the end of the street and attempt to communicate with whatever spirit decided to come through to speak with us. I made sure to grab some white candles, salt, and a piece of white chalk to create our circle. For those who don't know, white candles are used for protection, and salt is used to deter evil spirits. It's said that they can't pass over a line of salt. So we walked down to the end of the street. It must have been around 2 a.m. or so. There was nothing but the sound of crickets, the leaves rustling gently in the muggy summer breeze, and our random teenaged conversation. We sat down in a kind of triangle arrangement, and I drew the pentacle on the road in the middle of us, lit the candles, and put them in a circle around us along with a circle of salt. We all sat inside this circle, and I said a few words for protection. I'm still so glad I did. Who knows what would have happened if I hadn't. As the nominated leader of the circle, I began to ask whatever spirit to come through and speak with us, that we meant no harm, and for a while, nothing. Spike started to complain in the most condescending way she could, about how this was all a bunch of baloney, and blah blah blah, I'm better than you. I was never a huge fan of the girl, honestly. She was always kind of a douche clown. Just as soon as we were about to close the circle and go back to the house, the breeze came to a sudden stop, like all of the air was sucked away, and the noise stopped too. No crickets, nothing. Total, complete, stifling silence. I can only speak for myself here, but I was overcome with this heaviness, and my heart began beating faster and faster. Before we could even blink, we see rapidly approaching headlights to the right of us. A small white pickup truck was speeding towards us on the street behind where we sat. I still shake when I recall this part, and my eyes well up with tears. As the truck sped in our direction, I felt this other kind of fear, like I was trapped and knew I was going to die. The closer this truck got, the louder we heard it. The screaming. A woman screaming. This terrified, blood-curdling scream. She was just screaming and screaming. I remember seeing the shadow of a man driving, with another male's shadow in the passenger seat. As the truck passed behind us, the screaming louder than ever, I turned my head to the left to watch it as it went on down the road. Then I saw what haunts me most to this day. A woman in the back window, slamming her fists on it, pleading for help as loudly as she could, looking straight at me. Her eyes, man. Her eyes. She was so afraid. At the same time she was looking at me, I was bombarded with mental images of the men raping her over and over again. I won't go into full detail. The truck just kept speeding down the street until it just disappeared altogether, like it had never been there at all. Just vanished, right in front of our eyes, faster than a blink, and then silence. This had all happened in 30 seconds or less, but it felt like it went on forever. Slowly, the sounds of the crickets returned, and the breeze started up again. My sister, Spike, and I just sat staring at one another, unable to say anything. I shakily said a few words to close the circle before we picked up all of our things. We walked back to the house, turned on all the lights, and sat down and just stared at one another some more. Spike eventually broke the silence with, "What was that?" My sister said nothing, and all I could muster was, "I don't know." We all sat awake until the sun came up, not daring to talk about what had happened, or even really talking at all. In fact, my sister and I have only talked about it once more. I spent months thinking we were all just crazy. It was just a normal car, a practical joke, some sort of crazy mirage caused by the Florida humidity, that it couldn't have been real. I think I was right on one point, that it wasn't real, but in the sense that those people were no longer alive, or at least the woman wasn't. In my gut, I knew it then, and I know it even now, 11 years later. My only explanation, it had to be some kind of spirit memory, a replay, part of the last moments of this woman's life. The fear she felt, so great and powerful that it left an imprint on the tangible realm of our existence. You can choose to believe me, or to think I'm a nutball. To this day, whenever I see a white pickup, I freeze for a moment and say a small prayer for the spirit of that woman. I pray she found peace, and that her spirit is at rest. Growing up, I had a friend who I'll call Mandy, who lived a couple houses down from me. In fact, I had a group of about 3 girls I was extremely close to. We lived in a military city, and my block in particular boasted all Air Force families exclusively, strictly Catholic as well, except for Mandy's mom. I mean, sure, they attended Mass, but even as a kid, I would hear my other friend's mom gossip about Mandy and her single mother, how they weren't real Catholics and how bizarre they were. I never got to hear an explanation on what made Mandy and her mom fake Catholics, but now that I think about what happened when we were around 11 years old, I can guess. Mandy's parents had been divorced a long time, and her dad resided in California. I remember the summer before we were going to start middle school, Mandy took a month-long trip to stay with her father. When she returned and invited me over to spend the night, I was ecstatic and packed myself a little night bag. My other friend who had been over rolled her eyes and repeated something her mom had said about Mandy's house being a bad place. "You don't know what you're talking about," I remember snarling at my friend. It took her aback. I was getting really upset that so many of Mandy's so-called friends were being forced to stay away from her. I went over to her house that night, determined to be the best friend she could ever have. I even brought over some of my favorite DVDs and snacks for us. At that age, I was not into sharing at all. It was me trying my hardest to let her see she was deserving of a friend. When I got there, I immediately noticed something was off about Mandy and the house in general. For the last 2.5 years I'd known her and her mom. I knew they lived a little differently. For one, they always kept their house super dark. They lit candles a lot for natural lighting, and they played really soft classical music. If I was there now, I'd say it was freaking creepy. But at that innocent age and already witnessing so much judgment, I just thought it was eccentric in a way. With that being said, I went over after Mandy's return, and not a single light or candle in the house was on or lit. The only light coming in was from the hot Texas sun blaring through some windows which didn't have curtains. Even in this dimly lit place, I could see Mandy was extremely skinny. She must have lost 10 pounds on her California vacation. Mandy's mom was always really quiet, never talking whenever kids came over. This time was no different. Her mom was hunched over a book on the couch when I came in, and I politely said my hellos, and all she did was smile and nod. Mandy and I retired to her room. Although their house was not big, Mandy and her mom essentially had their bedrooms on opposite sides of the home. This hallway with her bedroom and bathroom was basically her wing of the house. Mandy said she had something cool to show me. A couple of months previous to this, Mandy had taken advantage of the fact that her mom was respectful of her privacy and never really went into her side of the house, so she would smoke cigarettes in her bedroom closet. So when she told me she wanted to show me something, I told her I really didn't want to smoke. Oh no, she insisted, it was something else. A Ouija board, tucked away under a blanket on a shelf in her closet. Even though I was ignorant on certain things, I knew the dangers of what that meant at 11. I insisted that she not bring it out, and I did not want to play with it. She seemed disappointed, but we did what we normally did afterwards. We watched some TV, played a movie, and she played with my hair. She told me how visiting her dad had gone, and said that she'd bought the board with him at some toy store. I didn't care if it was just a toy to her. I knew she had a deep interest in ghosts, and I liked that about her, but I said that people at church had told me how demons and Satan hid in the board. Granted, this was the simplification I was given at age 11, but luckily I was not dumb enough to give in just for the sake of playing a game. I remember asking Mandy an important question. Have you played with it yet? She denied it, said she hadn't even brought it out yet. She wanted to play with it maybe when we got our group of friends together. We never would. We went to bed that night really late for us, probably around 11:30. We squeezed into her little twin bed. I remember one of my last thoughts before falling asleep was that I had a huge wave of fear surrounding me. I was so uneasy it was even making my stomach hurt. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to disappoint Mandy or be like every one of our friends who left her out. You know those intense gut feelings before something bad or weird happens? That's what was happening to me. I took nearly an hour to fall asleep, only comforted when I would hear Mandy also turn over in bed, at least assured by her presence. We were quiet, but I knew we were both wide awake. Eventually we did go to sleep, but I know I didn't sleep for long. It felt like I'd just shut my eyes when I heard a loud bang. Of course, the room was pitch black, but I heard the bang again. I knew it was coming from the bathroom directly across the hallway. Mandy heard it too, and shuffled out to investigate while I stayed terrified under her covers. She came back and said that stuff on her bathroom sink had fallen over on the floor. She got back into bed without any worries. As soon as she did, we heard a very distinct knocking on her bedroom door. And no, we knew it wasn't her mom, not at this hour. After the knocks, there was a moment of silence. During this time, my thoughts are racing. Is there a robber in the home? Should we call 911? Mandy bolted up with impressive speed and turned the lock on the door. She grabbed me by my shaky hands, and we both got under her bed, trying our best to hold our breath, when something began to scratch on the door. Then it all stopped. No knocks, no scratching. I began to sob and Mandy shushed me, saying it was okay. She turned on a lamp in her room and went to open the door as I screamed for her to stop, to be careful. She said something like, "There's no one even out here." She was smiling sleepily, and I was continuing to cry, especially when I saw what was at the bottom of her door. 3 long scratches. She didn't have a single pet. When I pointed it out, she just dismissed it and said we should go back to sleep. I begged her to go tell her mom. She looked at me like I was crazy. She said her mom would freak out if we woke her up. I wanted to run home so badly, but I was also afraid to even leave that room. Reluctantly, I chose to stay. I asked Mandy if we could leave the light on. She turned the TV back on to calm me down. I fell asleep barely before the crack of dawn, and you can bet when the sun rose, I was out of that house. Mandy moved away about 3 months after that, and I never returned for another sleepover. I had already had paranormal experiences prior to this, but never like this. I was never able to physically see any evidence, only hear and feel. I remained friends with Mandy still, from a distance. I know at some point Mandy claimed that she had begun to play with the Ouija board after that night, and insisted nothing bad ever happened. She said she talked with the spirit of a little girl who had died in our neighborhood. Something told me she was lying, and that she had been playing with it, maybe that night that I slept over. Of course, I have no proof. I only have what I know I saw, clear scratch marks on the door. Interestingly enough, when Mandy moved, her house didn't get sold right away. There ended up being a pair of homeless squatters who broke in and lived in there for a few days. The realtor, of course, caught them and had them cited for trespassing. Rumor was, according to my friend's gossipy parents, that the squatters had been telling police they thought something was dead inside the house, maybe in the attic, because of the rotten fumes. Nothing was ever found as far as I know. And to make this story tie up a little bit more, as I got older, I reconnected with Mandy on Facebook, maybe 3 years ago. I wasn't friends with her mom, but through a little snooping on Mandy's page, it was clear Mandy had returned to live with her dad in California at some point. And when I did click on her mom's profile, I saw where her mom was proclaiming to practice some kind of witchcraft. I guess that's where the bad Catholicism came in. But all jokes aside, it made me wonder about that night in her house. Was it the Ouija board or something her mom was doing? I've never really gotten to do enough research on the subject, but thinking about it creeps me out to no end. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Be good to animals, even people. See ya. Hello. Hey, how have you been? No, I'm not laughing at you. I was thinking of something earlier that was funny. I'm doing alright, you know? Just trying to deal with the bad stuff and enjoy the good stuff, with a little help from the man upstairs. How about you? Well, that's awesome.
Hey, if you're gonna be blabbing on the phone all damn night, go outside. Or in your room or something. You asshole.
That was the man upstairs. I was just talking about him 2 seconds ago. He's all pissy today. Oh, you thought I meant God? No. I think Zeus did help my mom quit smoking, though, so that was nice. Oh, Zeus isn't real? If you say so.
Ja, snämmar, bjärksbes, hrish.
It's okay. It's me doing that. My sis. And no. There we go. I should have never done that.
There you go, my slooch.